May 31st, 1944, 07:36 hours, in the waters north of the Admiralty Islands. Commander Hamilton Hains stares at his radio in frustration. For 30 hours, 4 American destroyer escorts have been hunting a single Japanese submarine. They have fired over 20 Hedgehog salvos. Every single one has missed. The RO-105 refuses to die. Hains keys his radio and transmits 4 words that will become legend in naval history. Oh hell. Go ahead, England. Seconds later, the destroyer escort USS England fires her Hedgehog. 24 projectiles arc silently through the morning air, splash into the Pacific and sink toward their target. Then the ocean erupts. 6 to 10 detonations thunder from the depths. A massive underwater explosion follows. Oil and debris rise to the surface. The RO-105 is gone, and the England has just set a record that will never be broken. This is the story of the weapon that changed submarine warfare forever. A British invention that turned the mathematics of death completely upside down. For every 60 depth charge attacks, the Allies sank 1 submarine. For every 6 Hedgehog attacks, they sank 1 submarine. The Germans never expected a weapon 10 times deadlier than anything they had faced before. If this story interests you, consider subscribing. There are more untold moments from the war waiting beneath the surface. To understand why the Hedgehog mattered, you must first understand why depth charges failed. In 1939, the Royal Navy possessed exactly 1 weapon capable of attacking a submerged submarine, the depth charge. A barrel-shaped canister packed with 300 pounds of high explosive, dropped over the stern of a destroyer and set to detonate at a specific depth. The concept was simple. The execution was almost impossible. The problem began with sound. British ASDIC, what the Americans would call sonar, worked by emitting a pulse of sound and listening for the echo bouncing back from a submarine's hull. A trained operator could track a U-boat's position, depth, and heading with remarkable precision. But ASDIC had a fatal flaw. It could only scan forward and to the sides. It could not scan directly beneath the ship. This created what operators called blind time. As a destroyer approached a submarine, the ASDIC operator would call out ranges: 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards, 500 yards, and then at roughly 200 yards, the submarine would vanish from the screen entirely. The destroyer had passed directly over the target. The ASDIC beam could no longer reach it. Now the captain faced an impossible calculation. The submarine was somewhere beneath him, but exactly where? The depth charge would take several seconds to sink to its preset depth. In those seconds, a skilled U-boat commander could change course, change depth, or both. The captain was dropping his weapons blind, aiming at where the submarine had been, not where it was, and then the charges exploded. The underwater detonation of 300 pounds of TNT created chaos. The shockwave generated massive bubbles of gas. The water churned with turbulence. And for the next several minutes, sometimes up to 30 minutes, the ASDIC became completely useless. The operator could hear nothing but the dying echoes of his own weapons. The submarine had vanished into the noise. A skilled U-boat commander could use those minutes to slip away entirely. He could change course in any direction. He could dive deeper or rise shallower. By the time the destroyer regained contact, the submarine might be a mile away or gone forever. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. During the first few months of the war, only 5% of all depth charge attacks resulted in a kill. Under normal combat conditions, that figure dropped to 3%. The mathematics were devastating. A destroyer might need to attack a submarine 20, 30, even 40 times before achieving a kill if the submarine did not escape first. In April 1945, U-427 would survive 678 depth charges dropped against it over several hours. The submarine surfaced at the end of the war, surrendering at Narvik with its hull battered but intact. That single statistic captures everything wrong with the depth charge as a weapon. The U-boat's pressure hull was engineered to withstand enormous water pressure at depth. It could absorb the shock of explosions that detonated more than 20 feet away. Closer than that, the hull would crack, but getting a depth charge within 20 feet of an evading submarine was almost entirely a matter of luck. Britain needed something better, and they found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. Lieutenant Colonel Latham Valentine Stuart Blacker was not a naval officer. He was an army man, a veteran of Afghanistan and Russia, a pilot who had earned his flying certificate in 1911. During the 1930s, he had become obsessed with an obscure concept called the spigot mortar. Unlike conventional mortars that fired a projectile from inside a tube, the spigot mortar worked in reverse. A steel rod, the spigot, protruded upward from a base plate. The projectile itself was hollow, fitting over the spigot like a sleeve. When the weapon fired, the propellant charge inside the projectile drove it off the spigot and into the air. The design was crude, almost primitive, but it had one enormous advantage. The projectile could be any size. The diameter was not limited by a barrel. Blacker envisioned his spigot mortar as an anti-tank weapon for infantry, cheap to manufacture, simple to operate, powerful enough to stop German armor. When war came, Blacker brought his design to the War Office. They rejected it. The projectile could not generate enough velocity to penetrate tank armor. But Blacker was introduced to military intelligence research, a secretive department known as MD1, and from there his weapon took an unexpected path. Someone at MD1 realized the spigot mortar might have naval applications. They sent the design to the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the DMWD, a department of the Admiralty so unconventional that its staff called themselves the Wheezers and Dodgers. The DMWD was led by Charles Goodeve, a Canadian chemist who had already developed the degaussing system that protected British ships from magnetic mines. His team included the novelist Neville Shute, the motor racing photographer Louis Clementaski, and a rotating cast of brilliant eccentrics who operated from a pier in Weston-super-Mare that had been requisitioned as HMS Birnbeck. Goodeve saw immediately what Blacker's design could become: not an anti-tank weapon, an anti-submarine weapon, one that would solve the blind time problem forever. The concept was elegant. Instead of dropping depth charges over the stern, fire projectiles forward, over the bow, while the submarine was still visible on ASDIC, the spigot mortar could launch 24 bombs simultaneously, creating a circular pattern that would land in the water approximately 200 yards ahead of the ship. The submarine would be tracked right up until the moment of impact, but the real genius was in the fuse. Depth charges detonated at a preset depth, whether they hit anything or not. The explosion might be above the submarine, below it, or 100 yards away. The Hedgehog projectiles would use contact fuses. They would only explode if they struck something solid, like the hull of a submarine. This changed everything. A miss would be silent. The ASDIC would remain clear. The operator would maintain contact. The destroyer could immediately attack again, and again, and again. No more blind minutes. No more guessing. No more letting the submarine slip away in the chaos. And when a Hedgehog bomb did hit, it would detonate directly against the submarine's hull. No cushion of water to dissipate the blast. The full force of 35 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT, delivered exactly where it would do the most damage. The prototype launcher was tested aboard HMS Westcott in 1941. The weapon worked, but the first submarine kill would not come until November 1942, after Hedgehogs had been installed on over 100 ships. The Royal Navy was skeptical. The projectiles were small, the pattern seemed random, and there was something deeply unsatisfying about a weapon that produced no explosion when it missed. Depth charges might not kill submarines, but they terrified the crews inside. The thunder of detonations, the rocking of the hull, the uncertainty of whether the next explosion would be the one that cracked the pressure vessel open. This was psychological warfare as much as physical. The Hedgehog offered no such comfort. A miss was nothing but a splash and silence. Crews doubted the weapon. Captains avoided using it. In early 1943, the Admiralty had to issue a directive ordering captains to report why they had not used Hedgehog against underwater contacts. The problem was training and confidence. When an officer from the DMWD was sent to Londonderry, where convoy escort crews were based, he conducted shipwide talks and shared examples of successful Hedgehog attacks. The kill rate improved dramatically. By late 1944, Hedgehog attacks achieved a 35% success rate, based on 37 attacks and 13 confirmed kills. But the weapon came with dangers of its own. On September 20, 1943, HMS Escapade stopped to assist the frigate HMS Lagan, which had just had its stern blown off by a German acoustic torpedo. When Escapade detected the U-boat responsible and fired her Hedgehog, the bridge crew witnessed something terrible. One of the bombs exploded prematurely as it left its spigot. The blast practically blew off the bow of the ship. 16 men died. 9 more were injured. Signalman Richard Reynolds was on the bridge when it happened. He woke up with his nose split open, his bar and Stroud binoculars, which had been hanging around his neck, simply gone. Amazingly, the crippled Escapade still managed to tow the equally crippled Lagan back to Northern Ireland. The two shattered vessels must have been a bizarre sight as they limped into port together. The accident was caused by a faulty fuse, a problem that was quickly corrected, but it illustrated a fundamental truth about the Hedgehog. The weapon was only as good as the crews who operated it. With proper training and confidence, it was devastating. Without them, it was just another piece of equipment gathering rust on the foredeck. The Americans understood this. They adopted the Hedgehog in late 1942 as a form of reverse lend-lease, British technology flowing westward across the Atlantic, and American crews embraced it with an enthusiasm that British crews never quite matched. The reason was simple. American sonar operators had developed better tracking techniques. They maintained contact longer. They calculated submarine movements more precisely. And when they combined superior sonar practice with the Hedgehog's forward-firing capability, the results were extraordinary. No ship proved this more dramatically than the USS England. Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton took command of the Buckley-class destroyer escort in December December 1943. At 1,400 tons and 186 crew, she was not an impressive vessel, about 1/4 smaller than a proper destroyer, armed with only 3 3-inch guns instead of the 5 inches carried by larger warships. But the England carried a Hedgehog, and her executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, was obsessed with making it work. Williamson had conducted test firings of the Hedgehog into San Francisco Harbor while the ship was still being outfitted. He had studied the weapon's ballistics, its firing sequences, its optimal approach angles. He drilled the crew relentlessly. When the England sailed for the Pacific, she was one of the most thoroughly trained anti-submarine vessels in the American fleet. On May 13, 1944, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese submarine transmission. The I-16 was heading toward Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, carrying rice for beleaguered Japanese troops. The England, along with the destroyer escorts George and Raby, was dispatched to intercept. 6 days later, soundman Roger Bernhardt detected the I-16 at 1,400 yards. The hunt was on. The Japanese submarine commander was skilled. He employed radical evasive maneuvers, sharp turns, sudden depth changes, the standard tactics that had allowed countless U-boats to escape depth charge attacks. The England's first Hedgehog salvo missed. The second missed. The third scored a single hit, but the massive I-16 absorbed the damage and kept maneuvering. The fourth salvo missed. The fifth salvo landed true. Multiple detonations thundered from the depths. A massive underwater explosion lifted the England's stern clear of the water. 20 minutes later, debris began rising to the surface. The England had her first kill. She would not stop there. American codebreakers had discovered something larger. The Japanese had positioned a line of 7 submarines. The RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112 and RO-116 across a route that Admiral Halsey had used twice before to move the Third Fleet. Tokyo expected the American carriers to pass through that line. The submarines would report their position and attack. The Americans decided to roll up the Japanese submarine line from one end to the other. The England and her 2 companions would hunt them down, one by one. On May 22nd, the George detected RO-106 on the surface. The submarine crash-dived. The George fired Hedgehogs. Miss. The England gained contact and fired twice. The second salvo scored at least 3 hits. An underwater explosion confirmed the kill. On May 23rd, the hunt continued. The Raby detected RO-104. She fired Hedgehogs. Miss, 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 miss. 4 more salvos, 4 more misses. Then the George took over. Miss, 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 miss. 8 consecutive failures. Commander Hains ordered the England to attack. The England's first salvo missed. Her second salvo, fired at 0834 hours, struck home. Oil and debris rose to the surface. RO-104 was gone. On May 24th, the George detected RO-116 on radar just after 1 in the morning. The England gained sonar contact and fired. Her first salvo scored 3 to 5 direct hits. Breaking up noises echoed through the water, though without the massive secondary explosion of earlier kills. By sunrise, an oil slick covered several square miles of ocean. The England had now sunk 4 Japanese submarines in 5 days, but she was running low on Hedgehog ammunition. A hunter-killer group arrived on May 26th, allowing the 3 destroyer escorts to head for Manus to resupply. On the way, at 11:04 that night, the England detected another contact. She fired a single Hedgehog salvo. Direct hits. RO-108 went to the bottom without a fight. 5 submarines, 8 days. After resupplying, the destroyer escorts returned to hunt the remaining submarines. On May 30th, the USS Hazelwood detected RO-105 on radar. The last submarine of the Japanese picket line was determined not to die easily. What followed was one of the most grueling submarine hunts of the Pacific War. For 30 hours, the American ships pursued RO-105. The Japanese commander was brilliant. He stayed directly between 2 destroyer escorts for 5 minutes, preventing either from firing without endangering the other. He maneuvered constantly, unpredictably, using every trick in the submariner's manual. The George fired Hedgehogs. Miss. The Raby fired. Miss. The George fired again. Miss. The Spangler fired. Miss. Over 20 salvos arced into the water over those 30 hours. None found their target. Commander Hains was furious. He had ordered the England to hold back, wanting to give the other ships a chance at the kill. But RO-105 would not cooperate. Finally, at 0736 on May 31st, Hains keyed his radio and sent the transmission that would enter naval legend. "Oh hell. Go ahead, England." Lieutenant Williamson had been waiting. The England maneuvered into attack position. The Hedgehog crew loaded the projector. At the calculated moment, 24 projectiles launched in their familiar arc. 6 to 10 explosions thundered from the depths. A massive secondary explosion followed at 0741. Oil and debris boiled to the surface. RO-105 was dead. The England had sunk 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days. Of the 7 submarines in the Japanese picket line. 2 had returned to port before the hunt began. The remaining 5 had all been destroyed by a single ship. Admiral Toyoda had sent that submarine line to track the American fleet. Now his scouting line was gone. Worse, he had to assume that the heavy American activity at Manus and the destruction of his submarines indicated a strike against the Palau Islands. He repositioned his fleet accordingly. 2 weeks later, American naval and land forces invaded the Marianas instead. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell in rapid succession. The Japanese fleet, out of position, could do nothing to stop them. The England's Hedgehog had changed the course of the Pacific War. Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official historian of United States naval operations in World War II, recorded that Commander Hains sent a message to the England after the hunt. "God damn it, how do you do it?" The response from Commander C.A. Thorwall, whose flag flew aboard the England, captured the dark humor of men who killed for a living. Personnel and equipment worked with the smoothness of well-oiled clockwork. As a result of our efforts, Recording Angel working overtime checking in Japanese submariners joining honorable ancestors. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy, made a promise that day. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. He kept that promise. On October 6, 1960, the guided missile frigate USS England was commissioned, carrying the name forward into a new era of naval warfare. But the true legacy of the England was not in names or honors. It was in the weapons she carried. By the end of the war, the statistics were undeniable. British records showed that 5,174 depth charge attacks had produced 85.5 U-boat kills, a ratio of 60.5 attacks per kill. In comparison, 268 Hedgehog attacks had produced 47 kills, a ratio of 5.7 attacks per kill. The Hedgehog was more than 10 times as effective as depth charges. Think about that number. For every submarine killed by 60 depth charge attacks, the Hedgehog killed one with fewer than 6. The mathematics of undersea warfare had been transformed completely. The weapon had its limitations. The 35-pound warhead was smaller than a depth charge, requiring a direct hit rather than a near miss. A single Hedgehog bomb might not be enough to sink a submarine. You needed several in the same salvo to land true. And there was the psychological factor. Crews missed the thunder of depth charges, the visible proof that they were doing something, anything to fight back against the invisible enemy below. The Royal Navy eventually developed the Squid, a 3-barreled mortar that fired full-size depth charges forward with depth settings updated automatically by the sonar system until the moment of launch. The Squid achieved even better results than the Hedgehog, 50 attacks for 13 confirmed kills, a ratio of less than 4-to-1. But the Hedgehog came first. It proved the concept. It showed that forward-throwing weapons combined with maintained sonar contact could revolutionize anti-submarine warfare, and it was British. In an age when American industrial might was reshaping the war, when Lend-Lease flowed endlessly from west to east, the Hedgehog flowed the other way. A weapon born in the eccentric workshops of the Wheezers and Dodgers, based on the interwar experiments of an Army lieutenant colonel who had learned to fly before most naval officers were born, became the deadliest submarine killer of the Second World War. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker received £25,000 from the Royal Commission on awards to inventors for his contributions to the Hedgehog, the Piat anti-tank weapon, and related designs. He had earned it. His spigot mortar principle had become the foundation for weapons that killed submarines and tanks alike, 2 of the most feared weapons platforms of the war. Charles Goodye's DMWD continued developing unconventional weapons until the war's end. Their successes included the Mulberry Harbors used at D-Day, the system of degassing that neutralized magnetic mines, and weapons so secret that their full stories would not be told for decades. The Wheezers and Dodgers had earned their nickname. The Battle of the Atlantic cost the Allies 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships. 72,000 Allied naval and merchant seamen died in those cold waters. The Germans lost 783 U-boats and approximately 30,000 submariners, 3/4 of their entire submarine force. Those numbers would have been far worse without the Hedgehog. When U-427 survived 678 depth charges in April 1945, she proved what every submarine commander already knew. Depth charges were terror weapons more than killing weapons. They could rattle a crew, damage equipment, crack fittings, and create leaks, but they rarely delivered the fatal blow. The Hedgehog did not terrify, it killed. A miss was silence, a hit was death. There was no middle ground, no accumulated damage, no drawn-out hunt lasting hours while the submarine slipped away in the chaos of explosions. Either the projectiles struck home and the submarine died, or they splashed harmlessly into the water, and the attack began again immediately. The Germans never developed an equivalent weapon. They responded to the Hedgehog by bringing forward their acoustic torpedo program, creating homing weapons that could strike at the escort ships themselves. But they never solved the fundamental problem that the Hedgehog had created. The sonar operator maintained contact throughout the attack. The submarine could no longer vanish into the blind time. Remember Commander Hains's message to the England? "Oh hell, go ahead, England," 4 words of frustration that became 4 words of triumph. The England had proved what the weapon could do in the hands of a trained crew. 1 ship, 6 submarines, 12 days. That is not luck. That is not chance. That is 35 pounds of Torpex explosive, delivered precisely where British engineers designed it to go, directly against the hull. The Hedgehog never became famous. It lacks the romance of the Spitfire, the drama of the bouncing bomb, the mystique of the Enigma machine. It is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a technical curiosity, a strange-looking projector mounted on the foredecks of escort vessels, firing bombs that look like potato mashers into the cold Atlantic waters. But the statistics do not lie. 5.7 attacks per kill against 60.5 for depth charges, more than 10 times as effective. In the mathematics of undersea warfare, those numbers meant thousands of merchant seamen who lived instead of died, thousands of tons of cargo that reached Britain instead of sinking to the bottom, thousands of U-boat crewmen who met their end because a British weapon found them in the darkness below. The Germans expected depth charges. They had trained against them, developed tactics to evade them, built submarines to survive them. They never expected the Hedgehog, and that is why the tide turned in the Battle of the Atlantic.